In the cutthroat TV industry of today, a show has to be blazing hot in season 1 in order to survive the next year. While that does make for shows that are engaging from start to finish, it does mean that some shows can get cut off before they've had a chance to realize their full potential. In this video, we're looking at 8 TV classics that needed a few seasons to reach their peak. We're kicking off with one of the ultimate classics, Star Trek: The Next Generation. It's hard for people today to believe that The Next Generation could have any weaknesses. Airing from 1987 to 1994, it has defined the very nature of Star Trek for an entire generation of audiences. Who has some illustrious credits to his name, still counts Picard as one of his best characters. The show was something really special, and yet, in the beginning, the show wasn't as well liked as it would eventually become. Each era of Star Trek has had to follow the act of whatever came before, and The Next Generation's crew had to fill the place of William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and Nichelle Nichols. A few years in, though, people understood that they were watching groundbreaking TV. In fact, depending on who you ask, The Next Generation is the high watermark of the Star Trek franchise. There's been a lot of Trek in the years since this show, and they're all trying to achieve the greatness of the show. In fact, there's even a sequel series that brings back Patrick Stewart as Picard. Up next is an MCU legend, the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. While TV shows and special presentations on Disney Plus have officially become an extension of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it wasn't always that way. Marvel Studios wanted to get into the TV game since the early phases, but those shows needed a home. The ABC era of the MCU began in 2013 with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. In the beginning, the show was relying heavily on the fact that it was going to be tying in with the movies, and of course, it had Clark Gregg's Coulson, but there wasn't really anything of substance to latch onto at first. That is until the big twist of Captain America: The Winter Soldier made its impact known on the show. The show finished its run with glowing reviews, and yet they were never able to recover from the first impression. And of course, its canonicity with the MCU is a subject of debate, with fans desperate for any signs that Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. is a legitimate part of the MCU. Regardless, the show lasted for a respectable 7 seasons. The success of the show would also inspire Agent Carter on ABC, and of course, the many other Marvel shows that have come since. Moving on from Marvel to DC, there's Arrow. In hindsight, Arrow was a super influential show. It wasn't the first ever superhero series, but this CW hit showed us that it was about time to bring back the capes and cowls to the small screen. Yet that wasn't how people felt at the start, as the show had a pretty weak first season. The turning point for Arrow came during the second season, which pits Oliver Queen and his friends against Deathstroke. That season was one of the best ratings on TV that year, and it proved that Arrow was something superhero fans would pay attention to. In fact, if not for that season, the CW may have never gone ahead with their other DC shows, like The Flash, Legends of Tomorrow, and Supergirl. When it came to the so-called Arrowverse, the CW always struggled to find a balance between its usual style of content and the expectations of a superhero story. There were times when the CW absolutely nailed that balance, and there were times when it didn't. That being said, we think most people will be happy with the way things shook out by the time all was said and done for Oliver Queen. We'll move on to another classic, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It was clear from the start that Buffy had a great concept behind it. However, the show perhaps needed some time to find its footing, because the first season is not great. However, from the second season on, the show was firing on all cylinders, despite being a very geeky show at the time when geek culture wasn't so widespread. Buffy did really well for itself, going on for 7 seasons, and inspiring the spin-off show Angel. In fact, the love for Buffy has actually outlasted the franchise stint on TV. There are entire series of novels and comic books that continue the story of Buffy and Angel, as well as a collectible card game, some board games, and a tabletop RPG. There are 6 video games based on the franchise too. The show came a long way from its weak first season. It's a shame that the legacy of the show has been tarnished at this point, thanks to controversies that Joss Whedon attracted from just Justice League, and allegations of abuse from the set of Buffy. That stuff makes it really hard to revisit Buffy the Vampire Slayer, no matter how good it was at its peak. The next show is a lot more recent, The 100. By the time The 100 started airing, the Hunger Games trilogy was old news. Most people would have said that the trend of post-apocalyptic young adult stories had passed, and the first season of The 100 didn't inspire much confidence. By all means, the first season looked like a flash in the pan that wouldn't make it very far. But then the show started becoming a lot better and a lot more entertaining, and people started tuning in. While The 100 isn't exactly the most successful show the CW has ever aired, it got high enough ratings to sustain it through 7 seasons. That was something that no one could have anticipated when the first season was airing. Now, Parks and Recreation is another great sleeper hit. The names Greg Daniels and Michael Schur would be familiar to any fan of modern sitcoms. They both worked on the American version of The Office, and Schur was also one of the creators and showrunners of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Those were both great shows, and yet when Parks and Rec started off, people were really let down. It's common for sitcoms to take a season to find the right dynamics and voice for their characters, and that was definitely the case for Parks and Rec. The first season of the show was so weak that, in hindsight, fans will often tell new watchers to skip it. But the show did find its voice, and even in the second, Parks and Rec was already cementing its place in the annals of sitcom history. Speaking of Parks and Rec, the same rings true for The Office. That's right, the American version of The Office had a tough job to do with following up Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant's take on the concept, and things didn't get to a very promising start. Season 1 of the show didn't even have anything close to a full run of episodes. There were just 6, and people were left a little underwhelmed by those 6 episodes. Steve Carell's name recognition was what kept the show alive long enough for it to figure itself out. Thanks to the 40-year-old virgin, Carell got a massive boost in popularity that extended The Office's life. Good thing that happened too, because The Office has gone on to become one of the best sitcoms ever made. One thing that's unique about The Office is that it started off on a weak note, got really good in the middle, and then ended on a weak note. Steve Carell departed the show in the 7th season, and what came after that really showed how important he was to the show. And finally today, we'll look at Lucifer. Unlike a lot of shows we've seen today, there was a fair bit of hype going into Lucifer. It was adapted from the pages of Neil Gaiman's The Sandman that tops sales charts in the industry to this day. Lucifer was a fan-favorite character in that series, and audiences were excited to see how he would play out on TV. Plus, it starred Tom Ellis. So Lucifer was a police procedural show, and while the twist in the format was that the devil himself was working with the cops, it didn't translate into something different from your usual police shows in practice. You can't really compete in this genre when you have your CSIs and Law and Orders, so Lucifer failed to make an impression. That started to change as the show embraced the quirk of its premise. The show eventually emerged as a cult hit, lasting through 6 seasons. Fun fact, with the Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover event in the Arrowverse, Lucifer actually hung out with some of those heroes. That makes sense. Also, the Sandman was clearly part of the DC comic universe. It also means that we have a little Arrowverse crossover going on in this very video. That's it for today's video. Let us know in the comment section below if we left off any of your favorite late bloomer TV shows. And whatever you do, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.